The FlawedCast. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the FlawedCast. Today, we've got a very exciting episode ahead of you. I have a fantastic guest going by the name of Anna. I just want to disclose that Anna is not using her real name today, and if any listeners recognize them from either the voice or the context of the stories that we talk about, please be respectful and don't share who you might think this person is. So Anna is a person with a system who experiences dissociations, and dissociations are a very new concept to me, and I'm very excited for Anna to explain to us what exactly dissociations are and what life has been like dealing with those dissociations. Anna?
Hi. Yeah. So, hi.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited for this conversation. You have no idea.
Yeah. No, I'm very glad to be able to talk a little bit about this. I'll give a little bit of context of who I am, just so as people are listening, they can kind of like keep that in mind.
Mhm.
I am a recent graduate of a bachelor's of social work.
Mhm.
I'm a pretty big nerd. I've enjoyed being a nerd my whole life, and um, I
I
will
think
also
most of us have. It's just like a secret thing that's slowly coming out over time as it
slowly.
becomes more acceptable in our culture.
Yeah, that, and as well as I think is once you get to be an adult, you just don't care anymore. You're just like, I'm tired. I just want to have fun. Um,
Yeah.
but I'll add on to like maybe like parts of my identity is that I'm a survivor of trauma. I have been diagnosed with PTSD, um,
Mhm.
as well as yes, as you said before, that I have a system. So I want to explain a little bit about what that means. So.
Yeah, because a system is definitely terminology to me that is very new in my mind. And I like when I think of a system, I'm definitely not thinking of, the context of dissociations and how that affects you. So
Mhm.
be absolutely thrilled if you would go through an explanation for both myself and anyone who may be listening as to what that means to you.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Dissociation in general, if I want to just give a broad understanding of that, is a trauma response. It's a response that your brain does in order to deal with stress. So,
Hmm.
for people who've experienced pretty severe traumas, where they were not able to run away, where they were not able to deal healthily with the situation they were in, not being able to take control, their brain has a number of responses that it goes to in order to protect you. And I
Hmm.
mean just in the sense of like not overloading you with too much stimuli or making sure that like after this that you will survive. So when
Okay.
you're experiencing something like that, sometimes your brain does a thing where you freeze as well as it starts to kind of like shut down in a weird way. I can't really explain all of the details as well as I'd like to. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a
That's okay. I'm not a scientist either, and honestly, I may not understand them. So
I
I
well,
do get what you're saying so far. It's very, very base level. I'm still with you.
yeah, I don't think it's helpful even to even talk about it in scientific terms because then you get too much into it. But so for dissociations in general, there's kind of a spectrum. So for people who've experienced a lot of trauma, usually actually it has to be when your childhood, when your personality is developing, they begin to deal with that sometimes in a way called fragmentation, which
Okay.
basically means that your personality as you are growing up, which normally is, yes, as a child, it's developing, it's beginning to form together, it's becoming one. To keep you safe, it decides that it can't do that. So you'll have, instead of just one personality, one whole consciousness being able to kind of like run your brain, you have a number of them that uh, they're kind of like default like waves of consciousness. I'd kind of
Okay.
describe it in order to kind of keep you safe. So if you're in a situation that maybe you can't handle, you'll either maybe go into a dissociation where like you're not very present, you're consciously not there, or if you have something where like you have a system, your
Hmm.
consciousness fragments into different parts, and so those different parts will either take over or try to help kind of like run the body or run the brain and kind of a thing. Does it kind of
Okay.
make
And
sense?
Yeah, it does. And just like a clarifying question about that, what that experience is like, because, I've familiarized myself with psychology in the past, and I know things about like, having multiple personalities and stuff. But this sounds like it's not the same as having like multiple personalities. It's a different kind of thing where there's like multiple influences taking place, but you're not like a fully different person. It seems more like I, for lack of a better term, like a teamwork kind of environment where everyone's kind of in communication with each other. Is that correct in assuming, or?
I'm really actually glad that you brought up multiple personalities because it's actually pretty much the thing people think about when they think about a fragmented personality or a
Mhm.
fragmented consciousness. So, if people have seen the movie Sybil or they've seen not my favorite movie, Split, you'll hear the words like multiple personality disorder, but you'll hear actually also dissociative identity disorder, which is the word the term that they use now because it's more accurate for what it is. So with multiple personality disorders, a lot of people kind of remember seeing or might see where a person is one person in 1 minute and then they like act completely different. They can't remember
Mhm.
who
Yeah.
what they did before because another person was in control, and that can seem like pretty scary and intimidating. But really, what's happening is it's like I said, you've kind of got a number of um, dissociated like states of thinking, and those parts of the brain don't communicate very well, especially at first. Um,
Mhm.
so with so what they really want what I really want you to take away from this is that first, if you find somebody with a system, you don't use the words multiple personality disorder. That's outdated, and the
Mhm.
reason why that's outdated is because the assumption with that was that there was multiple like persons, like almost like you had multiple people. It was like different parts of the brains. You had two
Mhm.
personalities, which is that's not correct at all. It's
Very separated and independent from each other.
Yes, yeah.
Mhm.
Where even though with dissociative identity disorder, you are you yes, you can people who have that will say like I have like different people who are in charge. I don't have the same memories. I don't have the same experiences because when the person who's out front, um, person's kind of like the person who's in control of the body at the time,
Mhm.
when they stop being in control of the body, they might not know what's going on. So that's why it can feel like you're meeting a different person. Um,
Okay.
if that makes any sense. I'm trying to think if
Mhm.
there's anything else I'd like to kind of to speak with that. Um, but with that, I guess one thing I'd like to say is that dissociative identity disorder (DID) is just one part of the spectrum of people that have systems. It
Mhm.
looks different from a lot of people. A lot of people don't know they have it until much later. Really, the only well, not the only identifier, but like one of the main things that like you have to consider when you're considering if you do have a system or dissociative identity disorder or other specified dissociation disorders, is if you had that trauma at that very like pivotal age before the age of 9. And they again, like I said, they say the age of 9 because that's when your personality as a child starts to form. So
Mm.
uh, having trauma before that point doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have a fragmented consciousness, a fragmented personality. It just means that you're more likely to. That's when it happens. And that's when, if your brain decides it's how it's going to be able to handle the situations that it's being put through,
Mhm.
that's when it's going to happen pretty much.
So this kind of comes off as like a way that, because the brain's still very much developing at that age, this is a way that the brain responds to develop in a way that's going to protect it in certain situations. That's just sort of different than what other people tend to experience when their brains develop in terms of like response to certain
Hmm.
stimulus.
Yeah,
Which,
yeah.
okay, well, that's very interesting. And you say that like the root cause is typically like traumas of some sort or anything. Sorry,
Hmm.
not anything. Uh, the traumas of some sort that a person is going through that is kind of the ignition point of this process. Uh, and what constitutes a trauma that sort of, I guess, would be the like I would assume it'd have to be a sort of significant trauma, or is it like mild trauma? Like I know that it's hard to put that on a scale per se, but
Hmm.
maybe you can shed some light on my understanding of that.
Trauma is actually something I'm pretty interested in general. It's something I've been looking more into, especially as somebody who's planning on working in social work with mental health. And
Hmm.
hopefully later on when I am able to go back to school, get my master's in art therapy. Um,
Hmm.
and the thing about trauma is it's like first it is quite relative, because it really depends on what the person like what how the person experiences it, how the person views it, and what kind of tools does that person have to be able to handle that. And as a child, we don't often have very many tools to be able to deal directly with the stress of trauma. And a lot of what happens when it comes to being traumatized is really a key thing is how other people react and how other people respond. So, um, trigger, or content warning. I'm going to talk about some things that could be really like, hurt, bring up a lot of pain for some people. But
Hmm.
people who've experienced a lot of childhood trauma, for instance, people who might have a abusive parent, like they might have like live in a situation where they experience violence every day, either
Hmm.
bodily or just like watching it in their home, might might not feel traumatized if they have somebody else in their life that
Hmm.
they can find support or validates the fact that that was scary and that they shouldn't have to deal with that. In other cases where a child might experience the same thing, but without the supports or without that kind of ability to go and feel safe again, that would be, I think, a situation that would be more kind of, I guess, like more kind of
More likely to see the onset of a disorder sort of
a
stemming from
disorder.
it.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it's the same
Mhm.
things even with adults. It's like, when we talk about 9/11, a lot of people kind of can think about like there's certain people who did have PTSD and certain people did not get PTSD after experiencing the same thing. um
Mhm.
it really is relative to what you can do as a person if you feel like you're in control, to get yourself out of the situation, and or if you feel like people around you are responding to you in a safe way. And that's something that your brain is very good at picking up on is, are you
Mhm.
safe, and is there anybody that can help you? And I think like I like to think about my system as I did not have anybody to respond, and so my brain then made sure that whether or not I had someone to respond to be able to like
Mhm.
deal with my traumas and be able to um I guess like, be able to like handle my situations, that at least I would have a part of myself that was kind of made to deal with those situations. And
Mhm.
that's a pretty I think that's a pretty key thing. I do want to talk a little bit about the different types of dissociation disorders and what makes them kind of different when you're looking at systems. And I
Mhm.
think particularly one of the biggest things that could really indicate kind of like how you're going to experience a system is kind of the amnesia aspect. Um,
Okay.
yeah. So, what I was talking about before that, like when you think about people with multiple personality disorders, where they are one person one minute and then the next person they're another person, and that
Yeah.
person does not remember who or what happened during that time. So that's kind of on a bit of a scale as well. There's a number of different types of amnesia that people experience as a system. So the
Mhm.
typical one that people think of is the stereotypical memory amnesia, where they don't remember what happened at that time. Um, that could look like a person waking up and going to school and remembering that they were going to school, and then losing time and ending up in another place and not
Mhm.
being sure how they got there. And that can be an indicator of having a system, and that could help them lead to maybe seeking help or finding somebody that could to help them out. There's also things like people will say like, oh well, you're lying to me, and you're like, I don't remember saying that, and they're like, stop
Mhm.
lying to me about like the things that you did say. I like have proof that you did, and then it can feel very distressing,
Yeah.
who have that kind of amnesia.
And I know that in sort of past conversations that we've had briefly, there's a bit of a point of contention around that whole sort of how people perceive this memory aspect and the memory loss, and how they kind of play it off from time to time as being something that they can relate to. But it's not like just being forgetful. It's a very distressing kind of situation that you find yourself in, where you're in unfamiliar territory, if I'm not incorrect on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had people where I've talked about, like, I'd be kind of saying, like, and even not even 'cause I don't have the amnesia between my parts when I talk about,
Mhm.
like, my different, like, uh personalities, which people don't really use that either. Like, oh, what's your different personality? They don't really use that now. What
Yeah.
the terminology they use is either parts or alters, or I've heard some people call their alters headmates, which is kind of cute, I find. That doesn't
Hey,
really
you gotta bring a little joy to your life wherever you can find it, right? So if
yeah.
headmates suits you, let's go with headmates.
I tend to use alters or parts, or like my teammates, but
Mhm. I
that's kind
like teammates.
of,
Sounds
yeah,
very cooperative.
it definitely
Collaborative effort.
it feels more appropriate, I feel like, in my case. Sorry, I'm gonna have to ask you, what were we talking about before again? I'm having a moment.
It's okay. We were talking about a number of things, actually. I had a couple of questions, though, if you
Please,
don't mind, before we get too far away from them.
please do.
But before I get to an interesting game that I have recently happened upon is called Everyone is John. And it is a one-page tabletop role-playing game where everyone at the table plays like one aspect of this person, John's personality. And as you're going through this, I'm just thinking, it's like, oh my God, this is what John goes through. This
Yeah.
is this is who John is. And like a very large part of the game is actually like the way that you sort of reset and like introduce the narrative to new players is that like the game master will take control of the game, and John will just wake up somewhere
Hmm.
and have to figure out why he's there and what's kind of happened. And
Hmm.
so it's just sort of an interesting parallel that I kind of drew there. I was like, oh, that seems very similar.
Yeah.
But one of the things I was most interested in sort of asking you about was, you had mentioned that like the mind will develop an alter or a headmate, if you will, to in response to some sort of trauma. Now, my understanding and based on like our previous conversations is that your system is comprised of a number of these alters,
Hmm.
and I'm wondering if did they sort of arise like independently of each other at different times in responses to different traumas, or did they all sort of, well, maybe not all of them, but some of them could have came at the same time, or how did that kind of like come about that you ended up with the system that you're working with now?
Yeah, yeah. So it's been kind of a difficult. It's very difficult for myself, and I know for a lot of other people with systems, to articulate when a alter popped up, because
Mhm.
a good way to kind of talk about this is that I've heard a really good analogy for this is, you have a glass bowl, and it's a whole bowl, and it drops on the ground and it shatters into pieces. What piece is the original? And that's it's a perfect example, because when someone fragments, none is really the original piece, but they're all from the same original person. um,
Mm.
so I think that's a like it's difficult to like to have people ask, like, well, who's the original, who's the first one. um
I want to ask then, so would you describe sort of like yourself, or who you identify with most regularly, as just sort of like, I don't want to say just because it sounds like it's
no, no,
diminishing, but
that's good.
as one of many parts of a more holistic you?
Yes, yeah, that would be kind of a correct way to say it. There's some terminology, you can definitely look that up. I don't know all the different terms. They've said for people who are, I guess, like, or the parts of you that are out the most, they usually call that like the host, or like kind of the,
Mhm.
sometimes it could be like, a caretaker,
Yeah.
someone who kind of just like manages day-to-day things. So that's who I am. As Anna, I am the person who kind of manages most of the issues with the body.
Mm.
Now, when I do get stressed, that's when some of my parts kind of try to step in or try to like sound alarm bells. And that's something I wanted to talk a little bit about, is just like that awareness of, actually, no, sorry, give me a second. I've got to figure out what
No,
was the
that's fine.
word. I'm getting some 1 minute. words. It's
It's okay. There's a lot of information here, and I'm sure that there's many things that you've had to work your way through and experience, and giving the appropriate amount of time to each of them is got to be a difficult task to manage organizationally for you right now.
just a little bit. I think a lot of it is also just because this is such a like a difficult conversation to have. Um,
Hmm.
my different parts are trying to make sure that certain information is talked about, because that's a safety thing for us. If we don't spread it like the right information, it can
Hmm.
lead to more harm to other people, and so it's pretty important. um I
Hmm.
was talking about before, this is the fun part where you dissociate a little bit and then you don't remember what you were talking about. um uh, I'll just talk about that just for a moment. Is that people with even people who don't have the amnesia in between their parts, uh, they might experience either emotional amnesia or just regular dissociation where they don't remember things. So being patient
Hmm.
with them is pretty important, because it can be pretty stressful when you're either transitioning between different parts if they do have amnesia in between them, or even just having a dissociation episodes where you are unaware of who you are, or unaware of what's been going on, or
Hmm.
in general, your memory is not working very well. Um,
Yes. I've experienced times in my life personally where like my memory has not been working very well, not
yeah.
in a similar way, but
Mhm,
it's a thing where, and I'll share a little bit about myself here too, because I think
mhm,
vulnerability both ways is important in these conversations. But
mhm,
there is a year of my life that I just plain do not remember. Just
mhm,
in no way, shape, or form do I know what happened at the start of the year. I had a house. I had a bunch of cars. There was a job. I lived in a particular place, and then when I finally came to one day, I was living in the lovely town of Kitchener, Ontario, and I had no idea whose house I was staying in. I didn't know how I was affording it. I had a different vehicle than I'd ever remembered owning, and by and large, it was a scary time. I was like, how
mhm.
did I get here? And is this a dream? Like I'm sitting in this room that I don't recognize, and I'm just snapping out of it. And I was like, I don't even know what day it is.
Yeah.
And it was a different year, not even a different day. It was a different year. And it was terrifying. And it's like, thank God for technology sometimes, because, it's easy enough to pull up your smartphone and recognize some familiar people in there that, could have been in there as long as 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because we tend to take these things with us. But, I had to call people and be like, where am I? What is happening? And how did I get here? And it turned out like one of my friends was like, you were in trouble. I picked you up. And like literally a church that I didn't attend was paying for my rent at a house of one of their members for me to stay at for like 2 months. And I was like, well, that must be the best church I've ever attended, because they did something good for someone there. But, you know, a very concerning experience to wake up in a place where you have no idea what's just happened, or for how long it's happened, or why you are where you are. And it's just like, what have I been doing and what have I done? Like, if I
Mhm,
don't know what's happened, anything could have happened, which is terrifying.
mhm. I feel like when you're talking about that, that's a very real, regular experience that people with DID have, and
Mhm.
I'm really glad that you're like sharing that, because a lot of people with DID feel very alone in that experience. Um,
Medication, people, be
yeah.
careful with your medication. Sleeping pills are dangerous, no matter what the doctors tell you.
always,
Have
always.
somebody else check in to make sure you're still you.
That's very I relate to that. Having medication is it's very good to ask a lot of questions and ask like what are things to expect, or what you need to do to keep yourself safe.
I remember being happy to get a good night's sleep. I just didn't expect it to last for a year.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
You just wake up, you're like, "I'm feeling pretty great, but like where am I?" Uh,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So sorry, I'll let you get back to the experience with dissociation there. I just thought,
no, I
you
think that
know,
was good. That was good. It's good.
I wanted to illustrate the point that this isn't like regular amnesia, like forgetfulness is not what we're it was not
Yeah,
what we're talking
it's not
about.
like you forgot your keys in the house and you had to go get it, or like you're like, I had a bad night's sleep and I can't remember something. It's like you
Yeah.
literally don't know what you've kind of been doing. And
Oh, I got blackout
yeah,
drunk.
I got
Oh,
blackout drunk. I'm like, that's I don't.
not the same.
Yeah, no, I have literally avoided doing any kind of recreational kind of like substances just because I already had enough problems. Just the fact that like I would either like not know what was going on or something like that. So
Hmm.
it's like I do understand that that can also be very scary, but
Hmm.
it's definitely not the same thing because you have very little control of when that happens. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess going back to the different types of amnesia, I think that's what I wanted to get at, which was just the fact that like other kinds of amnesia happen for people on different parts of the spectrum. So for myself, I don't experience the amnesia part between my parts. I think there's only been one incident where I don't remember something happening and someone telling me that like I was acting very differently. And I think what happened was I had been with some friends, and my friend had been started to poke me in the sides, and I got very serious all of a sudden after, like, just enjoying ourselves. It was just fun and games, and all of a sudden I started reprimanding them, and they were kind of like weirded out by that, and I
Mm.
asked like asked me about it later, and I was like, I don't remember that, and having one of my headmates say, sorry, that was me, and
Well,
it's
that's a curious point you bring up there, though. Is that there was like a connection afterwards that was like, oh, hey, like, no, I recognize this, and let me fill you in on it. Is that
mhm,
like a common occurrence? Because I find that extremely curious that it's like, even though you don't have like
mhm.
the memory in mind of it happening, there's a part of you that can, interject and be like, oh, let me give you the updates.
Yeah, actually, I think that would be a good thing to transition to. I'll just quickly explain what emotional amnesia is, and then I'll maybe give some context of what I've experienced, just like for personal
Yeah,
I've
absolutely.
grown up with. So emotional amnesia is basically when you might remember something, but you don't actually like it's not like you connect with it. So it's like watching a movie in your head, but you're like, I did not experience that. So an example
Hmm.
would be like if you're watching Mad Max and you're remembering watching Mad Max and it was like full screen and everything, you couldn't see anything else but like that, like what the image was in your head, you would
Hmm.
know to yourself that that did not happen to you. You would
Hmm.
so emotional amnesia is basically like you were watching something happen, but you don't connect with it. So you have the memory, but you're like, I don't really feel like that was me. That was not me. So that's what that kind of like type of dissociation is. That part. Um,
Okay.
so that's not what a lot of people with DID experience. They can experience that a little bit, but that's not the main part of DID that makes dissociative identity disorder. That's going to be on more of the spectrum of other specified dissociation disorders, and again, you can go deep into that. But that's kind of as we're going past from DID, where you have amnesia between parts, and so people think that you're like many different people,
Okay.
versus other specified dissociation disorders, which you still have different parts who can identify themselves fairly individualistic. It could be also very like similarly, like they
Hmm.
could be, they be very similar to you or the person who's out the most, but there's still that emotional amnesia aspect part of it.
Hmm.
So just to, I guess we can talk a little bit about my growing up, and
Yeah.
know a
Yeah,
little
for
bit
sure.
how I interacted with my different parts. But I do need to go into a little bit about the trauma that I experienced growing up. I'm going to make it very
Yes.
brief and try not to go into some serious details because I prefer not to. Um,
I would encourage you to explore it to the fullest of your comfort zone, and I'm here to listen. And I think whatever you do end up offering, the people who hear it will find it valuable to know that this is something that you've gone through, and that in the end, it's a survivable thing that you're managing to have overcome at that point in time, and obviously progressed up until this point in your life, and accomplished many great things in the span in between. So
mhm.
uh, eager to hear what you have to say about it.
Thank you. Sounds good. Um,
Mhm.
so I think I'll just like add to it that like just to start off, just like kind of like prefacing this, that I do feel like I've come from a lot of privilege. I'm white. My family is fairly like, you know, well off. They are able to like support me, and so I've been able to get a lot of help that way because
Hmm.
I'm in a situation where I can do that. I think there's a number of people that have like, you know, disorders that do struggle with that, but that's not compounded with other things like systematic or economic like oppression and stuff like that. Um,
Hmm.
so to just talk about some of my trauma that I dealt with growing up. So the first trauma I remember, um, I was 8 years old. I was visiting my grandma after my grandpa had died, and I was with my family there. My little sister, who was not even a year old, was there with all of my cousins, and my parents had been out. All the adults had been out except for my grandma, and my uncle, who has a learning not a learning disability, a developmental disability.
Hmm.
He was already very agitated. He nonverbal, couldn't communicate, and because of everything that was going on with him, he attacked my little sister, and all of my cousins ran out. And so I was left there to make the decision of leaving my sister to die or to throw myself in front of her. So I that's what I did. I was attacked for I don't know how long. Um, it was very, very painful. It was very, very scary. And
Yeah, I
my
imagine it would
parents,
be.
yeah. And when my parents got back, though, I don't remember very well exactly what happened, but I do know that they didn't really respond to to me. They thought I was okay. They didn't understand the extent in which I was hurt, and I think that was because my grandma had gotten my uncle off me and was like
Hmm.
attending him, and so I think they were mad that he had hurt me. They knew that, but they did not know how bad that it was. Um, I have a learning disability as well, dyslexia, which makes the particular type of dyslexia I have makes it very difficult to communicate verbally and express myself. I've obviously come a long way since then, but
Hmm.
at the time, to talk about what was going on, especially being pretty much in shock and traumatized at the time, I couldn't express it. I could not express. And then like soon after that, my grandma came to live with me, with my family, and so I was with them, and I was very scared, and like pretty much all the time. I remember that I was terrified, but I don't remember acting like it. So I had the emotions of feeling scared, but I would
Was
never
it
like
was it just your grandmother that came with you, or was it a grandmother and uncle as well?
grandma and uncle. Sorry if I
Okay.
glossed over
Yeah,
that.
no, I just wanted to clarify that. It's like, okay, it's like that's yeah, because that makes a big that's a lot to internalize, and then to have that injected directly into your daily life and have to deal with it, and not necessarily have the people understand like the extent to which this event had affected you, and now it's something that you have to
Yeah.
face on a regular daily basis is a lot to put on a person, especially someone who's like 8 years old. I'm assuming
Eight
this was
years
a little
old.
bit
Yeah.
after, but like, yeah, that's a lot for a young mind to handle.
Pretty much. That's what I think.
Mhm.
Um, but and so it was quite a while where I didn't feel safe in my home, and I don't want to put too much blame on my parents. I will say they do take responsibility for the fact that like they did put me through a lot, but
Mhm.
um, because like I know that they too have experienced a ton of trauma. Both of my parents were traumatized as children, like severely, severely, and so when when it did come time to start talking about my trauma, because there was other things that happened. I was severely bullied. I, was nearly drowned a couple times by kids at school. Like there's just I could go on. I've had a number.
I'm just like, how many spaces in the school are there available for drownings?
I there we had like I went to my mom taught at a private school, and so we went there, and so there was like swimming lessons or whatever. Like
Okay, it's not
yeah,
like I went to school in Atlantis and the
they
other like
yeah
fish people just didn't understand that I couldn't
no.
breathe water.
Like, I'm sorry, I'm human, I can't breathe. No, this was just people being monsters, like, the typical stuff. Um,
Wow.
just children being children. Uh,
Now I feel lucky to not have had a pool at my school, I
I
guess,
know,
because
right?
children I have been in the high school environment. I've been in, the public school environment. I actually did a brief stint of teaching as a supply teacher in high school, and like children, you don't realize it as much when you are one of them, because that's sort of like the herd mentality, but children by and large are not nice.
No,
They are mean and they do not pull punches.
especially with like without like proper surveillance or parents actually wanting to like teach their kids. I again, well, I'd say rich kids are the meanest kids around.
Yeah. They
Uh,
understand the intent of their actions,
yeah,
but they do not understand the impact.
only second to people who think they should be rich, and then they just, oh, that's awful too.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, again, lots of different traumas at the face of other people. My parents weren't able to respond because they, I think what they like. First of all, I wasn't communicating because learning disorder,
Mhm.
and then when I did communicate, they, like, I think for my dad at least, he was kind of under the impression, well, I'm not hurting you, I'm not like giving you the trauma that I had as a child. Things might not This must not be too bad. And that comparison is like, not an accurate one, but it does
Yeah.
make sense. It does make sense to me, that he would think that way. Um,
Yeah, it to him it's lesser, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist
yeah,
still in some
yeah.
form, right? So it's like, okay, it's not as bad, so it's good, but like that's not exactly what the qualifier is for something to be good, is it to just
No.
not be as bad as something else?
So like I just want to say, like, I do understand that, like, he's still dealing with a lot, like, and so compounding that, as well as having a sibling that's on the autism spectrum and was out, acting out very, like, uh
Mhm,
very, like, aggressively at times, and then there was like other people in my family that had addictions and stuff like that, so we're like dealing
mhm,
with that kind of stuff. And um it just kind of compiled it where I didn't really have a place to feel safe, and I didn't have the ability to reach out. So
mm,
uh, I I was a very happy child, but I was a child that was in a constant state of like trauma responses,
mm.
basically.
Yeah,
Um,
distress.
yeah, distress. And I think people don't recognize that trauma responses don't have to be somebody freaking out and being panicked all the time. Trauma responses can be look very, very normal. Um,
Mhm,
so I was basically a traumatized child growing into my teens with not a lot of people supporting me in a way that would help me kind of like get out of
mhm.
those moments of where I was feeling very unsafe. Um, sorry, give me a second. My brain is just. I'll do that
No,
every
that's
once in a
okay.
while. My dissociations will kind of kick in, and I'll have to try to like read my notes to see where we've gotten to.
That's
Um,
okay.
mhm.
Uh, whenever you have a moment, my curiosity is like, you've clearly gone through a lot. How did you manage that and then still end up being productive and seeing yourself, through all that difficulty into being, a contributing member of society who is dedicating themselves to a life where they get to like give back and help people.
I would probably. Oh man, that's that's very relative. I feel like that's a very relative thing to talk about, because it's like, what does it mean to get back into society, and what does it mean to have like a
Mhm,
meaningful life? And I would argue that a lot of my ability to have a meaningful life was the fact that once I did start having more of my system be more out, a lot
mhm,
of that was contributed to the fact that I was able to express myself enough, not in a way that maybe I was able to articulate, I have a system and I have this knowledge that I have a system,
yeah.
because that wasn't till very, like, almost like last year, like, pretty much, I wasn't
Mhm,
able to identify that the things I was experiencing was me having a system. um, I would argue that a lot of that is because, like, I've got a number of, like, I would say that I have a number of things that personality wise, like, just naturally I have, which is like, I'm an upbeat person. I like people. I love being happy. I like making people laugh. Like those are things that like I would say that I have strengths in. Um,
I would agree there. I think you do a good job of many of those things,
thank
and you've brought a smile to my face on more than one occasion. And that's, I think, one of the most impressive parts when I think about you is like, this is a person who's experienced many things in their life and is quite honestly juggling a lot mentally, and yet you still have the time and passion and energy to commit to affecting other people's lives in such a positive way, and making sure that their experiences are being attended to in a way that's
you.
healthy and leads to positive outcomes.
Yeah. But I would really also argue that two things kind of contributed, that were not as much in my control. And I would say that actually having my system allowed me to be that happy person,
Hmm.
because I wasn't the one in my system that, when I was feeling like when the body was feeling stressed, dealt with that. That was put to
Hmm.
somebody else. So that's one thing. Um, but then also having people that eventually did respond and was very helpful. My mom's been an incredible aspect of my healing, even though she did not know what was happening with me.
Hmm.
Which we can talk about that a little bit right now. My teenagehood is when I started to hallucinate a little bit, and that's when I was introduced to my system. So when I first,
Okay.
yeah, so
That's this is news to me. So yeah, like by all means, take us down this road.
let's go here. So I'll first say that hallucinating as a teenager without drugs is actually quite common. Um, that
Mm.
because of the just like the natural way that your brain is developing and everything, it's put under so much stress, it doesn't feel right. Your brain like there's a I think it's like, it's 15%. It's like pretty high number of people when going through puberty will hallucinate in some way. So it's either like auditorily, visually, sometimes it's like other sensations like touch, smells, stuff like that.
This
Um,
might explain why so many people in my life have always asked me if I'm on drugs.
yeah, no, I had that growing up as well. People continually asked me if I was on drugs, and I would be like, no.
Oh, public school. Public school. I was in the off. People were like, "He's on drugs." I'm like, "I'm 6."
Yeah,
Like, I don't like, where am I getting access to drugs?
I don't know. I think a lot of people are just so quick to just assume that like it's drugs. There's
Ugh,
nothing else.
yeah.
Where
Someone behaving strangely for any reason, clearly drugs. They must be a deviant.
yeah, I think that's in general just a reflection on the way that people want to attribute like deviant behavior to things they don't like or things they can't control. But we can talk about that another time when maybe we're talking about social work or something. Um,
Absolutely.
oh my goodness. So I was hallucinating. A lot of my hallucinations were like the ones that like I now identify were just hallucinations. I knew were hallucinations. I was like, that's not real. That just can't be real. That doesn't make sense for that to be real. Um,
Mhm.
shadowy figures with no face, like smiling freakily. Like I was just like, that's creepy, but nothing new to me. I grew up with having nightmares due to the fact that I was traumatized when I was 8 years old. Actually, after that, I had started like I had stopped wetting the bed at like when I was like 4 or something like that, and then because of my trauma, I started wetting the bed again. I had a number of things happen after that, and had to deal with that. Grew
Mhm.
out
And I
of
think it's a fairly common side effect of
it.
people who
Yeah.
experience trauma, and it's unfortunate because there's such like a people tend to make fun of it, and they
Oh
don't realize that there's like a deeper, more significant, like underlying thing that's
yeah.
causing this response, and it's too bad because then people feel like unable to talk about it and really receive the help that they need in order to like attend to these issues.
Yeah, and there's already so much shame around being a victim, or even if you don't really realize yourself as a victim, or somebody who's been hurt by people who should not have done that.
Well,
Um,
even if people perceive you as a victim, like you don't have to believe you're a
yeah.
victim as long as other people perceive you as being a victim based on your circumstances and what they know about you, it can still have a negative effect and
Mhm.
come accompanying a lot of shame.
Yeah, yeah. And so adding on top of that something physiological that you can't really control, it's very difficult. I remember being really ashamed of that and feeling like this is the worst thing I've ever done. I'm now looking back, I'm like, baby girl, you were you were so traumatized. Like, calm down.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
so One day, when I was experiencing these hallucinations, I had started to kind of have this like person in my head, where they were very responsive and very, outgoing and very kind. And I'm I'm going to avoid saying all of my system's names, like my members of my system's names, because
Mhm.
I've been asked not to, by particular people in my system because they're more private and they don't feel comfortable. Um,
Okay.
with that, I'll call this one G, and G was a very outgoing guy, and I remember thinking like I don't know how these thoughts are so intense, but like I would ask questions in my head and I'd get a response. It wasn't necessarily like an auditorial thing where I'd hear it outside. It was definitely like there was a voice in my head, much like my own voice, but it was not mine. I did not associate it with myself.
Hmm.
And as I got to know this one more, I learned about two others. There was someone we can call E and somebody we can call P. And
Hmm.
P was someone from the ages of like 5 to 8 years old, very bubbly, very hyperactive. Was kind of actively trying to like wanted people to care and to kind of like be with them. Whereas E was very judgmental and was trying to kind of like was always very at the time was very concerned about the way I looked and the way I presented myself and
Hmm.
what what I could control, and it would make me super anxious. There'd be days where like I would feel like I wasn't allowed to eat, because everything didn't seem right. I couldn't. Sometimes I try to get ready to go to school, and any of the clothes, like the decisions that I would make for clothes, it would be like, no, that's wrong. Like that's incorrect. Like try again. And there's other I think I it's very difficult sometimes to when you're looking back to like figure out what's a hallucination sometimes and what was not. um
Hmm.
with There was two other, I guess, like I could say like parts that I remember. One kept on trying to get me to um basically go with them places, and I think it was basically trying to get me to leave places, to escape basically.
Okay.
And then there was another one that was I don't have a name for. I literally just called it like kind of the shadowy figure that was in my brain, and
Hmm.
that one was more dangerous. And there was an incident in where I scared my parents. I scared my mom very badly, uh, just in this particular incident. And after that is when I told her about everything. Um, she did a bunch of research, and my mom's a very smart woman. She's like fairly educated. She loves reading. She is all about kind of educating herself continually. And although she's like, yeah, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but what I'm reading from like this stuff is like hallucinations, basically. Um, Reading from this guy called William Glasser. I'll have to find the book that she read, but he basically said that like the hallucinations that people have are generally a reaction to the way that reality is. Um, like not matching up with how you as a person feel reality should be. Uh,
Okay.
so it's whether or not like your like the hallucinations are like enjoyable or not enjoyable, it just reflects the fact that reality does not make sense and you are in distress and it hurts you. So for me, I was not like reality did not make sense for me. I was not in touch with my body. I was not in touch with all my emotions. I could not be angry. I would not get angry. Like I could get sad, but I could not get
Hmm.
angry. And that was really telling to my mom. And so she asked me as we were talking about these different, now again I can call them parts now, asking like what did they ask me to do? What did they want? And so I described it, and she's like, okay, here's the thing. You can listen to them. You can figure out what they want in regards of trying to figure out what they feel like they need, but they're not in control. And so that was
Hmm.
kind of like how I progressed in life, was trying to figure out what they wanted, trying to get some of their needs met. And as that started to happen, things got much better, much better. I
Hmm.
was having less like incidences where I was feeling highly emotional. And that's sort of what led me afterwards to go to therapy after high school, because at that point I started listening to them enough that like they were very much more quiet. Like I didn't feel like they were around as much. And that's when I started being able to realize that I had a lot of pain from my childhood that needed to be dealt with. And because I was having panic attacks at work, I'd be in the middle of something and all of a sudden I'd feel panic. And um, that's when, like, I went to, therapy. I got, diagnosed with PTSD. I tried to bring up my different parts, but the therapist was like, we're not going to talk about that. Um, and uh,
Helpful when your therapist doesn't want you to talk.
yeah,
It's just like, isn't that what you're here for? Is to listen? Like, I don't think you really get to decide the context of the conversation.
no, it's a whole time. That's another thing is, unfortunately, people with dissociation disorder do face a lot of problems in the mental health sector, because a lot of psychologists, people who are professionals, people who are doctors, don't believe that dissociation's a literal thing.
Mhm.
They don't
Yeah.
believe it, even though it's like there's enough research to be like it's definitely something going on. So finding a doctor that actually accepts the fact that you have a system, or accepts the fact that these things aren't just like you imagining it or trying to deflect or lying is very difficult.
Mhm.
But anyway, I do think that the psychologist I went to see was very good. He helped me kind of process my trauma, and gave me basically permission to have boundaries with my family and say, no, I don't want to see my family. I don't want to see those people, like these people right now, because
Yeah.
it's too painful, because they do not recognize that they have caused me harm. And so I need to have that boundary. So I have had that boundary, and that's been great
Mhm.
for me.
It's
Um
helpful when you have what's called agency in life in order
I
to
know.
be able to control, the situation and make your own decisions. And then,
Mhm.
again, environmental mastery is another aspect of well-being where we're able to adjust to the environment that surrounds us and help make changes to it so we find ourselves in a position that's most comfortable for us. And
Mhm.
it sounds like you were given permission to explore those options and that had a benefit.
Mhm, mhm. It's pretty much what that is. I think a lot of people with trauma don't feel they have the right to have those boundaries, or to be free to allow themselves to feel comfortable, because it's not natural for them. A lot of people have, like, a part of their trauma is being told, like, this is not a big deal, like, get over it, something like that. So having the permission to be like, no, you don't have to get over it. Like, you can, there's things that you need to do to heal, but you do not have to let people back into your life, or that are going to be either, like, like, continuing to hurt you, or like ignoring the fact that you've been hurt. And that's not okay. um
Hmm.
Sorry, i'll
You
i'll
want
sorry, pardon.
I was just gonna say, you want to make sure the people that you're maintaining in your life and any relationships are supportive of you and aren't, dismissive of the things that you're going through. And, they're working to help create the type of environment that you're most comfortable in.
Hmm. And actually, as I think, like, that actually was kind of the catalyst of me meeting my next my next alter, my next part.
Mhm.
So a number of years later, I was like, okay, my head's quiet, everything's fine, I don't hallucinate anymore, everything's pretty great. Um,
Yeah.
and at that point, I was pretty happy with that, because that meant that I didn't have to deal with feeling like I was a crazy person. Like, I don't like to say that, like, because people, it's really stigmatizing, but that's what I felt like.
Yeah.
Um, but then I was still dealing with a number of things at home. Again, there was still, like, issues with a family member that was struggling with addiction, and still a number of, like, fairly stressful and violent things happening in my home life. Um,
Mhm.
and so one day I was going to work. I was on the bus, and I remember just having, like, thinking, and then having a thought that felt very familiar. It wasn't the same sort of voice as before in high school, but it was something new. And I was like, oh shoot. Oh crap. I don't want to go back to that. So I was like, okay,
Hmm.
just don't give it a name. Maybe if it doesn't have a name, I won't have to deal with it. And I remember right after that, almost immediately, I heard, "Hi, my name is Seth," which Seth has given permission for me to talk about him. And he said,
Seth was like, I already have a name. You don't get
no,
to
yeah,
choose.
well, no, and I think there's some alters that most alters that I know about from other people tend to choose their own name.
Yeah.
I think everybody else in my system pretty much chose their name. And so Seth was like, "Hi, I'm Seth. Uh, I want to kind of integrate with you, and that's the goal, but I can't do that right now. So my what we can do is work together. So if we can work together, that'll be fine." And I was like,
Hmm.
okay, that's not too bad. And for a number of years, I just like basically had Seth in my head, and it was not bad. He was always very supportive, and he was trying to like make sure I got up for like for work or for like the activities I wanted to do, or kept me motivated, like, keep going, in general was just very, very supportive. And but what I learned about Seth as we got to know each other a bit more, um, as I talked in my head, was that he kind of represented the anger and the anger that I was not feeling in my life.
Uh,
So he held a lot of that. So now that
mhm.
we have enough context about these kind of like different alters and personalities, I can talk a little bit more about like the purposes, I guess, of different parts that people have. Um,
Mhm.
so with my previous alters, like, there was, a person who was kind of like more of like kind of very caretaking. G was very caretaking. He was kind of a caretaker of my system.
All
Um,
right.
there's a thing called a is it prosecutor? Prosecute. I think that's what it's called. A prosecutor alter, where they've identified like, that they're often in a system. There'll be somebody who represents the trauma that has like happened to you. So like for you to be safe, sometimes having those thoughts of trauma will be
Okay.
represented by like a person who's had to deal with it. And so they like this part has had to deal with it so much that they internalize it and they turn it towards not just themselves in the system, but everybody else. Um,
Okay.
so this particular the altar that I talked about that would be very judgmental of my clothing, that I have identified words. I have identified that one was kind of like a prosecutor. Um,
Okay.
and then there's a lot of people will have an altar that is like younger, and they call them like littles,
Yeah.
basically. And that is also very common because when you're traumatized as a child, you often either like end up not being able to have a childhood after that, or
Mhm.
um, sort of have to say goodbye to that headspace of being like carefree, because now
Yeah.
you've experienced something awful. And so having like a part of you that keeps that is very, very common. um, and then with Seth, he was kind of like a protector. Seth is very much like he was in charge of that. So there's a
Okay.
number of roles that they can have, and there's also, I would say that there's different like there's like some other different aspects that you can look into. Like feel free to, anyone listening to this, like look up like different parts of like altars and everything. But uh just with um with Seth particularly, he held a lot of my anger that I was not feeling. So
Mm.
at one point, I had been dealing with some not so nice friends. And after I started feeling very angry, after finding out that I had been very much like betrayed, my trust had been betrayed
Mhm.
by these particular friends, was when I started to feel in myself anger. Not just like as in Seth was feeling it and I could kind of like take that on, but it was
But you personally
I
were feeling anger for like the first time.
yes, I let myself feel anger, and that was when he was like, "Okay, we can kind of like work with this. If we like, I'm so sorry that you're dealing with this. I don't want you to be dealing with that, but you're feeling angry about people are mistreating you. We can start to kind of like integrate," which
It's integration time now. We can do the fusion dance.
pretty much pretty much. And I'll just kind of quickly speak to integration because I think a lot of people worry about integration because for some people with integration it means like everybody coming together, which I have found is pretty much not permanent and it's not necessarily the right movement. It's not the right direction for everybody with a system. So
Mhm.
I think, like, for myself, the goal had always been to integrate with my system, because all of my parts had been kind of like, after I had kind of been listening to them, were like, yeah, no, integration's fine. If we get all our needs met, that's okay. Um, but after this last year where I experienced another trauma, woo, um, I started experiencing some severe dissociation like I had never had before, where I was actually not able to figure out who I was or where I was or what I was doing. I'd have to keep reminding myself if I had to drive someplace that I was driving. I had to tell myself over it, like in my head, um,
You are driving.
I am driving.
You
Yeah,
are driving.
and
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about my system honestly in a while, because it hadn't been important. Um, when all of a sudden I started hearing Seth again, and I started hearing my other system like team members and everything, like
Mhm.
it just kind of happened. I am looking at the time. I don't know if I can get more into that. Can I?
It is okay. Don't you worry about the time right now. I think we're at some good, interesting discussion here about how this works. So just you keep going for right
Okay.
now.
All right. I just don't wanna, I don't want. I worry. So
Don't worry. I'll fix it in post. I
sounds
don't know how, but
okay.
let's just give you confidence.
Thank you. Okay. So, last year I did experience a pretty severe trauma. I like my whole concept of being safe was shattered. I experienced some gun violence, and my
That's extreme. That is
yeah,
extreme.
very extreme. My school didn't respond very well. Like the social workers that were supposed to be a part of like the practicum were not responding the way they should have, and so I reverted back. I kind of went back to feeling not safe again, and it really did trigger a lot of my PTSD.
Mhm.
And a couple months later, again, I started dissociating, and that's when my alters kind of came back, and I was very stressed by this because I thought I had dealt with it, and I had been working so hard to keep everything kind of like the same. So that's when I
The image I'm kind of getting of this that just keeps sort of like rolling around in my mind as you talk about it is like, if Anna was a ship and the alters were the crew, and sometimes you don't like the ship's in port and it's nice and it's good, and the crew's off doing whatever they need to do, and then sometimes you just need to move the ship, and that's when they seem to come back and help you deal with those things that need to get done as like a holistic unit to get that ship, for lack of I'm not saying you're
no,
akin to a
no,
ship
that's
anyway,
fine.
but to
Yeah.
to where it needs to be,
Yeah.
or to somewhere new that is different and preferable to where it is now.
Yeah. They basically came back, was like, everything's wrong. Like, this is not like, they didn't do that, but they were like, we're back. We don't know why, but like we're back and we need to figure out what's going on. Um
We have rec- we have seen the bat signal.
pretty much the body has said that we're in trouble, and so like we can't just be quiet anymore. Um
Mhm.
and that's when I started doing a little more research about DID and like dissociation disorders, because I had talked to a doctor after my parents thought I had like Alzheimer's, because I'd be wandering in my house like it was just it was
That
bad.
would be very early onset Alzheimer's.
Yeah, no, they were like, it's not Alzheimer's, but like it looks like it's just my mom's grandmother had Alzheimer's, so she was like, this is way too familiar for me, and it was not comfortable for her. But
Yes, yes. Not a good disease. My grandmother also had Alzheimer's, and my
it's not
father's currently dealing with early onset dementia right now.
oh, it's
So
hard. That's
I understand this.
Mhm. So they were trying to figure out what was going on with me, and when we heard dissociation, I did some more research on it, and I was like, okay, like there's some dissociation that makes sense. And then I came across like DID and some oh my gosh, like documentaries and interviews with people who had DID, and immediately it was like all of us in my brain was like, oh my gosh, this is what I experience. this is this is what's been happening to me almost my whole life. And it was interesting to start looking at it as, instead of hallucinations that were trying to tell me something about my brain, as parts of myself that had been silenced like in so many different ways, not just by myself but by the people around me, because my discomfort with my trauma was not acceptable in their eyes. So
Mhm.
having that was very freeing, and I was very like nervous to self-diagnose, because when I heard DID, I was like, this doesn't feel exactly the same thing, because I'm always talking with my parts, and when it comes to them taking kind of more of a front role or being in charge or coming to the front, it's I'm always still aware. So I wasn't really sure about that, and that's when I learned a little bit more about OSDD, so other types of dissociation disorders. Um, and that it was just amazing, because then what that
Mm.
did for me was like give me more skills to start use letting my different parts be able to get what they need.
I think
I
it's also important to recognize that that would also give you a lot of perspective on who you are as a person.
so much.
Like, finally, I'm looking in the mirror and I'm seeing myself, where all of these years I've looked in and like the reflection staring back at me has seemed like unfamiliar.
It really is. You look back at your life and you go, that like the people that or the people in my head I was interacting with, it wasn't just like some random hallucination that told me that I needed to do something. This is me. This is like my
Mm.
whole person. Like, and I know a lot of people with DID or systems don't really like to think that way, and I don't want to push that view on them, that like those parts of themselves are them. That's maybe like they're not in a place where that feels right for them. But for me, it was very empowering, because it made me realize that if I was going to accept myself, I needed to accept all of them. So what that kind of led me to do was start to use, like, honestly, like my social work skills for facilitating groups on myself, which was it was very weird, because I would have conversations with everybody. I'd be like, everybody has to be here. We have to talk. We have to figure what's going on. And it was because I was inviting them to be able to do that, they had space to talk about it. It wasn't just me like asking them like, why are you freaking out? And it wasn't like just them saying that, like, well, like you need to do this so that we can like be safer. Like, for instance, like, again, I'll talk about Seth since he's much chiller about me talking about him. Him being the person who wants to like to be protective, and like, you know, has that ability to have boundaries, and honestly doesn't really care too much about what other people think, because he'd much rather be safe. That's his job. It's to make sure that we're all safe.
Mhm.
We had a really good conversation where I like said, like, I'm going to do what I need to do to have more boundaries, but I need you to soften a little bit. You need to work to kind of let yourself feel a little bit more, so you can be vulnerable and safe, so we can start to kind of like being on
Yeah.
the same page. And it was, and I can say this now, that he was like, like, oh shit, I'm sorry. I'm really
My
sorry. My
bad.
bad. Yeah, no, and it was, and I think we did a lot of that in my system, and we talked a lot about, especially for our prosecutor in our system. We had to I had us everybody kind of like sit down and say like one nice thing about everybody, which was, it was hard. It was really hard, especially for the like for everybody to talk to the prosecutor person in our system, because their job is to be judgmental. And
Yeah.
when we started looking at more of the positive things about that, when like it came to looking at the fact that like that judgment was actually a way to keep us safe, to be able to like have opinions and not feel bad about that, like that
Mhm.
that was really important. We like as a whole system, like we and I realize now that that was part of the reason why I had a really hard time with even dating anybody, because if I'm not having any judgment or any boundaries, again, you know, Seth having that boundaries, then how am
Yeah.
I supposed to have proper relationships and to be vulnerable in a way that's safe, so that when I'm
Mhm.
with a person, I'm not putting myself or them like in a situation that's either dangerous or um like potentially like uh disgenuine, because I'm not listening to every part of myself. And if I start to have
Yeah.
angry feelings, that like, or resentment for a person, it means I haven't been listening to my full self and
I
listening to
mean, I have a hard enough time listening to like the one person that I've got go I mean, I guess I'm a
yeah.
Gemini, so like someone's gonna say that counts as two,
Yeah.
but like I can only imagine what it would be like trying to corral the opinions of a group of people into like, yep. we're all good on this.
Yeah.
It'd be a very difficult process to deal with.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing that like the goal has been not so much to integrate now. Like I've got a counselor now that I talk to. I haven't ever had anybody that's actually like believed me or like tried to work with me on this now. But they're like, yeah, it seems like you've got a system. And
Mhm,
they've been actually pretty good because I've said I don't want to actually pursue getting a diagnosis. I don't think that for myself that a diagnosis would be helpful because like I have been pretty functional. I've been really privileged to be pretty like on the more mild side of the dissociation disorders. Like even though right now I can't work because my dissociations when I do dissociate are pretty intense, they
mhm,
I'm still able to like function in a way. I'm still making art, I'm still communicating with people, and now that I'm going into therapy, now that I'm actually getting specific and like direct treatment for my dissociations and having a professional that is considering not just like who I am but me as a system,
mhm.
that's been incredible. So I've been able to kind of like do a lot of changes and feel a lot more calm, and that's reducing the
Yeah.
dissociation.
I think that's a really good transition here as I consider, how to wrap this up in terms of just finishing up in a good amount of time, but more than happy to have like a further discussion on it if there's a point that you'd like to come back and speak more to this, because it certainly is interesting. I know I've been engaged and listening the whole time. It's probably the quietest I've been because I'm like, oh, this is a lot to learn.
Mhm.
Um, but one of the things that I'd say is like, given that you've had these variety of experiences and how people have responded to, your identifying as a person who has dissociations in their lives and a system, and the mixed sort of bag of responses you've received from both like close loved ones, friends, family, and professionals, like if there's other people who are going through something similar to this, what would your like recommendations be to like help them with that process and get to the point where they're able to manage this sort of effectively and be happy with who they are?
So I would say that first of all, like everyone's journey is very like very individual, and so
Hmm.
for somebody who is experiencing or might think that they have a system or has just learned that they have a system because like if they have DID and they're not aware of everybody in their system, to to be very gentle with themselves first of all, and then also look into getting yourself a support network that makes sense for you. So I would say that coming out to everybody isn't going to be necessarily safe, especially because there is still so much stigma. I don't want to pretend that we don't live in this world, and I don't
No,
want to acknowledge the fact that it can be unsafe for people like of different types of mental health.
it's absolutely true.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to talk about. Some ways I would recommend kind of starting that journey is like to find other people online that have like come out about their dissociation disorder, or maybe even like look at the ways that they recommend for people to come out. For me, what's been really helpful is I've actually added myself onto a DID and OSDD Facebook group. I've got two that I'm on, and
Okay.
just having that, like, to have a space where like I can say like I'm having a really hard day. I can't seem to stay like in control right now. I feel like no one's taking kind of the wheel in my body right now. So like what do I
Mhm.
do? Like that's been very freeing, and that's been very helpful. So starting there is I think a really good place. Other than
That sounds.
I would say that you should just make sure that when you do come out to friends that like you come out to people that you do trust, and if it doesn't work out very well,
Mhm.
don't worry. That's like do try again later once you feel a little safer, okay? Um yeah.
And I think that's something to keep in mind too, is like other people, you may have been processing this for a long time and it's, shocking to you in terms of like, oh my God, the discoveries and the things I've had to learn along the way to get to where I am.
Yeah.
And other people may just not be ready for that yet. And they may also need time to process it. And I'm not saying that,
Yeah.
if they react poorly, that's like okay and you should just accept it. But as with anything in life, give people a chance to process information, and then if they're willing to sit down and have the discussion afterwards, and learn something, I would say that that's a benefit, that at least one more person out there in the world has come to a place of understanding where they want to know more and be supportive, right?
Mhm.
And I think with that, if we're good for it, I want to close up on a little bit of a thought I had, because one of my favorite concepts in life, and just a beautiful idea in my mind, is like this Japanese concept of, it's called kintsugi, or also known as kintsukuroi, I believe it's pronounced. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's essentially the art of taking something, because you used the analogy, the perfect analogy at the start of this podcast, of like a bowl or something dropping to the ground and shattering into a million pieces. And kintsugi is essentially the art of mixing like a gold or platinum or silver powder up with some sort of a lacquer, and recombining these pieces in together to make something more beautiful than it was when it was originally just a bowl. And I think like hearing your experiences of like having these parts of the system come in together and integrate into you is like the visual representative example of what that sounded like to me. And I thought it was such a nice thing. So in a way, in my mind, you might be more beautiful than the regular person for having gone through these experiences and learned to deal with them.
Well, thank you. That's very nice. My system has some like opinions about that, but most of them are snarky and silly. But like overall, I think it's very good. Thank you.
You're welcome, and hopefully it was more on the positive side there with the group.
The snarkiness was more just because a number of them are very sarcastic, and it's very good. But yeah,
That's okay. I'm a sarcastic person myself, and I can understand how that might have sounded. So
no,
I just
it was
wanted
just
to.
so beautiful. It was just like, let's just like wreck it.
We must destroy it. Then he can put it back together with gold and see how he does.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on today and being vulnerable and sharing all this. And I know this has been a little bit of a longer podcast, but I think that it was important to talk about the things you were talking about, and that value was there. So I just want to say thank you so much for dedicating this time to sharing your story. I know it's a very vulnerable thing to do, and it can feel kind of scary and risky. And I appreciate that both you and the rest of your system managed to come on board and share what that experience is like, and hopefully help some people.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, and thank you for creating a space where we can talk about this. And hopefully, if people hear this, they will know a little bit more.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. And for that, we'll be ending today's podcast. So I encourage anyone who's still with us, if you're enjoying the content here, please do like and subscribe. It will be very helpful to help me continue to bring this content to the forefront of people's minds, so that we can discuss these very important topics and have a space where it's okay to be yourself and to express these things that sometimes we feel aren't necessarily what we should be talking about publicly. But ultimately, finding a place where you can discuss who you are and what you're feeling, and really discover who you are at your core is important. So thank you for coming along and joining us on the FlawedCast today, Anna. And with that, we'll see you all next time, everybody. Goodbye. The FlawedCast.